Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Berkeley and to the Fall 2016 Horace M. Albright Lecture in Conservation with Robert Kennedy Jr., who'll be sharing his thoughts with us on our environmental destiny. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Keith Gillis. I'm the Dean of the College of Natural Resources and a professor of forest economics. Before we begin, just small housekeeping details. Photography, please don't. We're going to be videotaping the entire event, recording it, and it'll be available on the website next week. And there will be time at the end for Q&A. You'll find index cards on all your seats, and please write your question on cards and pass them to the end of the rows. We've got runners to pick them up and bring them up to the front for the Q&A session. And I would say, please remember that the probability of your question being answered is increased both by legible handwriting and by conciseness. We'll get to as many questions as we can at the end of the discussion. Ask everybody to, fulfill the admonition that quiet technology is the best technology, and check the switch on your phone. The Horace Albright Lecture series at the College of Natural Resources has been going strong for 50 years now. It's a wonderful tribute to Horace Albright's achievements. And we're really pleased to have this opportunity to have this lecture series to continue the public good that Horace Albright worked so hard for. It gives us a wonderful opportunity to foster a dialogue on the critical issues facing our society with respect to conservation and sustainability. I'm very proud that as I look back over the years, the Albright Lecture Series has brought to Berkeley a veritable who's who among the world's most thought-provoking and innovative thought leaders. And the lecture you're about to hear aligns perfectly with the spirit and tradition of this series. This year, just because we don't want to be in a rut, we're going to do something different, and we're doing this lecture as a partnership of the College of Natural Resources and the School of Law here at Berkeley, and in particular its Center for Law, Energy, and the Environment. Professor Holly Doremus, my friend and colleague from the School of Law. Holly, give a wave. Holly will come up and help me moderate the Q&A session following Mr. Kennedy's talks. Holly is the James H. House and Hiram H. Hurd Professor of Environmental Regulation, Faculty Director of the Center for Law of the Sea, Faculty Co-Director of the Center for Law, Energy, and the Environment. Holly and I are locked in a fierce competition for who has the most hats. We're going to have to tally it up and see who's winning. I'm going to welcome Holly to the stage after Mr. Kennedy's lecture. So now let me say just a few words to introduce our distinguished speaker. Mr. Kennedy's environmental achievements and lifetime work are really quite remarkable. His work with Riverkeepers and the restoration of the Hudson River garnered him recognition as one of Time Magazine's heroes for the planet. Mr. Kennedy is still active with the Hudson Riverkeepers, as well as senior attorney for the Natural Resources Defense Council and president-at-large of the Waterkeeper Alliance. He's a partner in Silicon Valley's Vantage Point Ventures, a clean tech investment group, and was named one of Rolling Stone magazine's 100 Agents of Change. He's a high-profile political speaker, and activists around the world appreciate his efforts to keep critical environmental issues in the public eye. If you look at The Guardian, you'll see he had a piece just today, which is a very thoughtful reflection on the critical issues facing management of the Colorado. Among his books, New York Times bestsellers Crimes Against Nature, which called into question the environmental policies of the United States, and Riverkeepers, an impassioned first-hand account by Kennedy and John Cronin on the fundamental right to enjoy our invaluable natural resources. Most recently, he was featured in the 2011 Sundance Film Festival in the acclaimed documentary The Last Mountain, a story about the ongoing struggle we face to balance our energy needs and environmental concerns in the heart of coal country. An issue that resonates with me, given my family roots in Kentucky. Mr. Kennedy's writings have also appeared in the Washington Post, the LA Times, the Wall Street Journal, and many more high-impact outlets, just as the editorial that I spoke of today in The Guardian. It's my distinct honor to welcome our fall 2016 Albright speaker, environmental attorney, activist, author, and political leader Robert Kennedy Jr. to the podium. Please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you, Keith. I'm going to stand here. I'm happy to be here. I'm assuming this microphone is working. I want to apologize for my voice, which should get better as I speak. And I spent some time talking with Keith. I want to thank the law school and Keith and Holly for having me, for hosting me. But I was talking to Keith at the reception, and he told me that he was an environmental economist, and I thought what I'd try to do is to talk about the kind of intersection between the environment and the economy and also democracy, and all of those things are intertwined. And to do that in the framework of my work with the Hudson Riverkeeper and with the Waterkeeper Alliance. Hudson Riverkeeper was the first riverkeeper. It was started in 1966 by a blue-collar coalition of commercial and recreational fishermen who mobilized to reclaim the Hudson River from its polluters. We have on the Hudson one of the oldest commercial fisheries in North America. It's 350 years old. Many of the people I represent come from families that have been fishing the river continuously since Dutch colonial times. It's a traditional gear fishery. They use the same fishing methods that were taught by the Algonquin Indians to the original Dutch settlers of New Amsterdam and then passed down through the generations. And one of the enclaves of the commercial fishery on the Hudson is a little village called Crotonville, New York, which is 30 miles north of New York City on the east bank of the river. And the people who lived in Crotonville in 1966 were not your prototypical kind of affluent environmentalists. They were factory workers, carpenters, lathers, electricians. Half the people in Crotonville made their living, or at least some part of it, crabbing or fishing the Hudson. These were families that had little expectation that they'd ever see Yosemite or Yellowstone or the Everglades or the national parks. They couldn't afford to take their families on those vacations. For them, the environment was their backyard. It was the bathing beaches, the swimming holes, the fishing holes of the Hudson River. That was their recreation, but it was also their property values, and it was their livelihood. Richie Garrett, who was the first president of the first riverkeeper on the Hudson, used to say about the Hudson, it's our Riviera, it's our Monte Carlo. Richie Garrett was a grave digger from Austining, New York. He used to tell his new followers, I'll be the last to let you down. In 1966, Penn Central Railroad began vomiting oil from a 4.5-foot pipe in the Croton-Harmon rail yard. And the oil went up the river on the tides, and it blackened the beaches, and it made the shad taste of diesel, so they couldn't be sold at the Fulton Fish Market in New York City. And all the people in Crotonville came together in the only public building in the town, which was the American Legion Hall. And the room that they sat in is almost exactly the size of this one. There were 300 people there. They were leaning against the rifle racks at the back of the room and hanging out of the rafters. And this was a very patriotic community. Crotonville, New York had the highest mortality rate in World War II of any community in our country. Virtually the entire male population joined the Marines the day after Pearl Harbor. And almost all the original founders and board members and officers and members of Waterkeeper were former Marines. They were combat veterans from World War II, Korea, and later on Vietnam, and their families. These weren't radicals, they weren't militants, they were people whose patriotism was rooted in the bedrock of our country. But that night they started talking about violence, because they saw something that they thought they owned, which was the abundance of these fisheries that their parents had exploited for generations, and the purity of the Hudson's waters. And those things were being robbed from them by large corporate entities over whom they had no control. And they had been to the government agencies that are supposed to protect Americans from pollution, the Corps of Engineers, the Conservation Department, the Coast Guard, and they were given the bum's rush. The Richie Garrett and another Marine who was a Korean War vet, and another Marine named Mark Glauca, who at that time was an Eastern Airlines pilot, but they were both avid fishermen. And they went to 20 separate occasions to the Corps of Engineers office in Manhattan, begging the Corps Colonel to do his job and shut down the Penn Central Pipe. And the Corps Colonel finally told them in exasperation, these are important people. Speaking of the Penn Central Board of Directors, we can't treat them that way. And by this evening, in other words, we can't force them to comply with the law. And by this evening, in March of 1966, virtually everybody in Crotonville had come to the conclusion that government was in cahoots with the polluters. And the only way that they were going to reclaim the river for themselves is if they confronted the polluters directly. And somebody suggested that they put a match to the oil slick coming out of the Penn Central Pipe and burn up the pipe. Somebody else said they should roll a mattress up and jam it up the pipe and flood the rail yard with its own waste. And somebody else stood up and said that they should float a raft of dynamite into the intake of the Indian Point power plant, which at that time was killing 1 million fish a day on its intake screens and taking food off their family tables. And then a guy stood up whose name was Robert Boyle, and he was a combat vet from Korea. He was the outdoor editor of Sports Illustrated magazine. He remained there for 65 years at Sports Illustrated, and he was one of the gurus of dry fly tying in our country. He was a famous fly fisherman and angler, spin fisherman. He'd written half a dozen books on fishing. 2 years before, he had written an article about angling in the Hudson for Sports Illustrated, and researching that article, he had come across an ancient navigational statute called the 1888 Rivers and Harbors Act. And that statute said that it was illegal to pollute any waterway in the United States. You had to pay a big penalty if you got caught, but also there was a bounty provision that said that anybody who turned in the polluter got to keep half the fine. And Boyle sent a copy of that law over to the libel lawyers at Time Inc., which owned Sports Illustrated, and he knew them. And he said to them, is this still good law? And they sent him a memo back saying, in 80 years, the bounty provision has never been enforced, but it's still good law and it's still on the book. And that evening, when all these men and women were assembled in this American Legion Hall talking about violence, he stood up in front of them with a copy of the law and a copy of the memo from the attorneys, and he said, we shouldn't be talking about breaking the law. We should be talking about enforcing it. And they resolved that night they were going to start a group that at that time was called the Hudson River Fishermen's Association. It later became Riverkeeper. And that they were going to go out and track down and prosecute every polluter on the Hudson. 18 months later, they collected the first bounty in United States history under this 19th century statute. They shut down the Penn Central Pipe for good. They got to keep $2,000, which was a huge amount of money in Crotonville, New York in 1968. There were 2 weeks of wild celebration in the town. And they used the money that was left over to go after Ciba-Geigy, Tuck Tape, Standard Brand, American Cyanamid, the biggest corporations in America, and winning their case and winning tens of thousands of dollars. In 1973, they collected the highest penalty in United States history against a corporate polluter. They got $200,000 from Anaconda Wire and Cable for dumping toxics at Hastings, New York. They used that money to construct a boat, which they called the Riverkeeper. And in 1983, they used bounty money to hire their first full-time riverkeeper, a former commercial fisherman named John Cronin. He hired me a year later using bounty money as the prosecuting attorney for the group. And I had worked for the DA's office as a prosecutor, but I always knew that I was going to spend my life doing something to do with the environment. When I was 8 years old, just to give you a biographical kind of anecdote, when I was 8 years old, I wrote a letter to my uncle. President Kennedy was in the White House, saying that I wanted to talk to him about pollution. And he had me come to the Oval Office, and I caught a salamander the night before, and I brought him that as a present. The salamander had died because we had just gotten chlorinated water. It was a big spotted salamander. And So we spent a lot of the meeting arguing about the health of the salamander. And he was prodding it with a pencil and saying, I don't think it looks well. And I was saying, no, he's just sleeping. And afterwards, we released him in the Rose Garden. But he arranged for me, I told him I wanted to write a book about the environment. He arranged for me to meet his Interior Secretary, Stuart Udall, and also Rachel Carson, who at that point was in a battle which my uncle played with his USDA and with Monsanto and a number of other big chemical companies, and my uncle played a key role in vindicating her by appointing a commission that reviewed everything in Silent Spring and verified that it was all true. And so I always knew that I wanted to do environmental stuff. I had not taken any environmental law course when I went to college. I went back to night school at Pace University, which is in the Hudson Valley, and specialized in environmental law so that I could be a better advocate for my client as I worked for Riverkeeper. And when I left, when I graduated with my master's degree in environmental law, the faculty asked me to open an environmental litigation clinic. And so for 30 years, I've run this clinic where I have two professors who help me teach, but we have 10 students, third-year law students, who practice law, who have a court order that allows them to practice law under our supervision as if they were attorneys. We give each of those students 4 polluters to sue at the beginning of the semester. They file complaints, they do discovery, they do depositions, they go to court. They argue their case. Of course, they don't win the case, they don't pass the course. And I'm just kidding about that. We've brought over 500 successful legal actions against Hudson River polluters. We forced polluters on the Hudson to spend over $5 billion remediating the river. Today, largely as a result of our work, the Hudson is an international model for ecosystem protection. This is a waterway that was a national joke in 1966. It was dead water for 20-mile stretches north of New York City, south of Albany, 0 dissolved oxygen. It caught fire, it turned colors depending on what color they were paying the trucks at the GM plant in Tarrytown. Today, it's the richest waterway in the North Atlantic. It produces more pounds of fish per acre, more biomass per gallon than any other waterway in the Atlantic north of the equator. It's the last major river system left in the Atlantic. And I'll throw in the Aegean, the Adriatic, the Mediterranean, the Dardanelles, the Bosphorus, the Marmara Sea, and all of the rivers that flow into those waterways. There's only one left that still has strong spawning stocks of all of its historical species of migratory fish, and that's the Hudson. It's Noah's Ark, it's a species warehouse, it's the last refuge for many of these animals that are going extinct elsewhere. And the miraculous resurrection of the Hudson has inspired the creation of riverkeepers now all over the world. Last month, we passed a milestone. We licensed our 300th riverkeeper. I went over to Ladakh in India to do the ribbon cutting and to do water sampling with this new group that actually is run by a Buddhist monk. But we have them now in 38 countries. Each one has a patrol boat. They have a full-time paid waterkeeper, and they defend a single waterway and the people who live along it, the quality of life of those people who rely on that waterway for their livelihoods, recreation, etc. We have waterkeepers on almost all the West Coast, the major West Coast rivers, from Prince William Sound, Cook Inlet in Alaska, Fraser River in BC, the Puget Sound, the Willamette, the Columbia, the Tualatin, San Francisco Bay, which is one of our first riverkeepers, Santa Monica Bay, the Orange County coast, Santa Barbara Channel, all the way down to Laguna San Ignacio. In Mexico, we have 29 keepers in Mexico, mainly commercial fishing groups who operate patrol boats and are licensed by us and track down polluters. And we have a picket line of vessels patrolling the West Coast. We have keepers on almost all of the East Coast rivers, from the Bay of Fundy in Canada to Biscayne Bay in Miami, and we're the fastest growing water protection group in the world. There's a couple of kind of common themes that hold all of the keepers together. And one of those is this idea that the waterways are part of our democracy. that it's a democratic right, that the waters are owned by the people. They're not owned by the polluters or the government. They're owned by the people. Everybody has a right to use them. Nobody has a right to use them in a way that will injure or diminish their use and enjoyment by others. This is an ancient right. It's a law here in the Constitution of the state of California says that people of the state own the waterways of the state and own the fisheries of the state. They're not owned by big agriculture. They're not owned by the oil industry. They're not owned by the fracking companies, the dairies. They're owned by the people. Everybody can use them. Nobody can use them more than their share or use them in a way that hurts other people's use of them. That's what the law says. The law is not always obeyed, but that's what the law says. This ancient law, it goes back to Roman times, the Code of Justinian. It's in the Magna Carta. And from the beginning, it was recognized as part of the natural law rights of humanity. And I'll just give you a little kind of history lesson, and this is a digression, but this whole talk has already turned into a digression. In ancient Rome, one of the first efforts at constitutional government was the Code of Justinian. And that code guaranteed, if you were a citizen of Rome, you had an absolute right to walk across the beach, throw in a net, and take out your share of the fish. The emperor himself couldn't stop you. It was part of what was known then in the Code of Justinian as the public trust assets, or the commons. Those things that are not susceptible to private property ownership, but by their nature are the property of the community, the commons, or the commonwealth. Those are the air, the water, the wildlife, the fisheries, the public lands, the wandering animals, and in ancient Rome, the aquifers, and they had a thing that we would consider a national forest. They had forests back then that were for public use. Those things belonged to everybody. And everybody, if you were a Roman citizen, you had a right to use them. Now, one of the rules is that any time, as soon as you see a deterioration of democracy or the assertion of tyranny, one of the first acts of tyranny always involves efforts by powerful private entities within a society to privatize the public trust. So when Roman law broke down in Europe beginning at the 375 AD, for the next 800 years, the Dark Ages, you had local kings and feudal lords who were reasserting control over the public trust. For example, in England, King John said the fish no longer belong to the people. He sold monopolies on them to his friends. He actually created corporations for the first time, limited liability corporations, and created monopolies. And he sold monopolies on the fish, that was the social safety net. If the crops didn't come through, if you lost your job, if you didn't have money, you could go catch a fish. You could feed your family. But now you couldn't do that anymore. You had to pay a wealthy man for the right to catch that fish. He also privatized the deer and the game animals. He said only nobility, and specifically people he licensed, were allowed to use them, and that's what got him in trouble with Robin Hood. He also erected navigational tolls on the Thames and the other rivers of England so that, again, these were all social safety nets. What was once free, which was going up and down the river to sell goods or to visit people, you now had to pay for. And those constrictions on democracy so enraged the people that they rose up, led by the barons, and confronted King John at the Battle of Runnymede, and they forced him to sign the Magna Carta, which was the beginning of constitutional democracy on this planet. The Magna Carta is the birthplace of virtually all of our Bill of Rights, even ones we don't have anymore, like habeas corpus. But it also, and right to jury trial and a bunch of other stuff that we no longer have in this country. But also, it has chapters on free access to navigable waters and free access to the fisheries. And those rights descended to the people of the states when we had the revolution in our country. And in fact, those rights, and I'll tell you another, this is a real digression, because I just was watching on TV a thing about the Tea Party. I come from Boston, and my grandmother took us up to see the Constitution and told us 100 times about the Tea Party. They think that the that effort by King John to start corporations culminated in the creation of the biggest corporation on earth, which was the East India Company. And the Boston Tea Party, which they think, those people on Capitol Hill now, they think it was about taxes. It wasn't. It used to be that Republicans hated big government. But when they talked about, like Barry Goldwater talked about big government, he was talking about the capacity of the government to intrude on your life, to invade your privacy. Privacy and liberty were the same things in the minds of the conservative, and they ought to be, because they're identical. But the modern Tea Party person does not understand that's not what big government, to them big government just means the taxing power, that they don't want to pay taxes. So the Tea Party, the Boston Tea Party, the reason that it was a revolt against taxes, but what it really was is that the merchants of Boston were all forced to pay a tea tax, but the British East India Company was exempted from it because it was owned by the Queen and the King at that time and some of her friends. That's what they were revolting against. They were revolting against monopoly power and corporate power, not about taxes. It was about monopoly and corporate power. But those rights from the Magna Carta descended to the people of the states. And the law in this country, in every jurisdiction in this country, up until 1847, was that if you owned a factory, and I owned land next to your factory, and the smoke from your factory got onto my property as little as 1 day a year, I had an absolute right to shut down your factory. In fact, the courts had no choice. There were no damages remedies at that time. The only power they had was the power of injunctive to enjoin the nuisance, and the nuisance had to be enjoined. It was regarded, if somebody put smoke or pollution from their property onto my property, it was regarded as a trespass, and it was an interference with my use and enjoyment of my property or the public property, the commons. It was illegal. So those laws were eroded beginning of the Industrial Revolution in our country through corruption, et cetera. And the pendulum swung way the other way, and the person who alerted Americans about how costly the abandonment of those laws was Rachel Carson, a little oceanographer from Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, who never saw the ocean until she was 21 years old. And she wrote this extraordinary book. She was a poetic writer, and she wrote this book that was on the bestseller list for a world record number of months. And in 1970, the culmination of what she was teaching Americans was Earth Day 1970, the biggest public demonstration in American history. I remember what it was like before Earth Day. I remember the Cuyahoga River burning in 1969 for a week with flames that were 8-story high, and nobody could put it out. I remember Lake Erie being declared dead. The last fish was gone. I remember the same year, the Santa Barbara oil spill that closed all the beaches in Southern California. When I was a little boy, I used to visit the White House, and there were a pair of eastern and Adam peregrine falcons nesting on the roof, and I was a falconer from when I was a little boy. I was fascinated with hawks. I wrote the laws that regulate falconry in this country and wrote the exams that you have to take to become a falconer. But I used to watch those birds. It was the most beautiful predatory bird in our country. And it was salmon pink and it had a white sear on it, so it could fly 240 miles an hour. And I could watch them come off the cupola of the post office and come down Pennsylvania Avenue at those speeds and pick pigeons out of the air 40 feet above the heads of the pedestrians on the sidewalk on Pennsylvania Avenue in front of the White House. For me, seeing that sight was much more exciting than visiting my uncle at the White House or my father at the Justice Department. But that bird went extinct in 1963 from DDT poisoning. And all of these insults, this accumulation of insults, in 1970 drove 20 million Americans out onto the street, the largest public demonstration in American history, demanding that our political leaders return to the American people the ancient environmental rights that had been stolen from our citizens over the previous 80 years. And the political system responded. Republicans and Democrats got together. Nixon created EPA, signed the Clean Water Act, signed the Clean Air Act. We passed 28 statutes, the Endangered Species Act, Safe Drinking Water Act, over the next 11 years. Superfund and CERCLA and RCRA, all these statutes that protect air, water, wildlife, fisheries, all of the commons. And those statutes were, a lot of the industry was saying, oh, all these new laws have, but these were ancient laws. It was just an effort to resurrect and codify the ancient laws that had always existed. And a lot of times I'll sit across a negotiating table from a polluter who says, we didn't know it was wrong to fill that wetland because these are all new laws that were written by hippies after Earth Day. And but they always were. It was never okay to pollute. In fact, in the 16th century, they had a Clean Air Act in London that made it a capital crime to burn coal in a stove in London, and people were executed for it. So it's never been okay to pollute. It's always been wrong, morally and legally wrong. It's always been wrong. And what Earth Day did was simply to codify those laws. Now, one of the other things that I learned from Waterkeeper, because the riverkeepers, the fishermen they were capitalists, and they were small business people. And they knew, and they had been in business, their families, for 350 years. But during my tenure there, and when I started, there were 1,000 commercial fishermen on the Hudson. During the Great Depression, 10,000 men went down to the Hudson and made a living or fed their family. It was the social safety net. There was 1,000 permanent commercial fishermen on the Hudson. Today there's only 2 because General Electric polluted the river and it was illegal to take the fish commercially. So those fishermen knew that they had a functioning business model, that the reason they were out of business was not because their business model was flawed, but because democracy had let them down. Because the General Electric company had lobbyists, better lobbyists than they did in Washington, and was able to distort the laws. What they did was illegal. They weren't allowed to put their PCBs in the river, but they forced the governor, by blackmailing him with the loss of 60,000 jobs, they forced him to allow them to violate the law and dump their stuff in the river, because they said, if you don't let us do it, we're going to go to New Jersey with the 60,000 jobs, and we'll do it from over there, and your river will still be polluted, but you won't have any jobs. So Rockefeller went along and allowed them to do it, and Governor Carey after him. And then 10 years later, they left the Hudson Valley and took all 60,000 jobs with them. They don't have any jobs now in New York State. And they left with their pockets stuffed with cash. At that time, they were the richest corporation on earth. But they left behind a $4.6 billion cleanup bill that nobody in the Hudson Valley can afford, and 1,000 fishermen out of work permanently. And we lost the culture and the contributions to our economy and to our palate of that industry. So, and these fishermen knew, you hear all the time from the, Koch brothers and the big polluters and their toadies on Fox News and their indentured servants and, the Capitol, that we have to choose between economic prosperity on the one hand and environmental protection on the other. And that's a false choice. And that's what the fishermen knew. In 100% of the situations, good environmental policy is identical to good economic policy. If we want to measure our economy, and this is how we ought to be measuring it, based upon how it produces jobs and the dignity of jobs over the generations, over the long term, and how it preserves the value of the assets of our community. If, on the other hand, we want to do what the Koch brothers want us to do, which is to treat the planet as if it were a business in liquidation, convert our natural resources to cash as quickly as possible, have a few years of pollution-based prosperity, we can generate an instantaneous cash flow and the illusion of a prosperous economy, and we can make a couple of people billionaires by impoverishing the rest of us. But our children are going to pay for our joyride, and they're going to pay for it with denuded landscapes and poor health and huge cleanup costs that are going to amplify over time and that they will never be able to pay. Environmental injury is deficit spending. It's a way of loading the costs of our generation's prosperity onto the backs of our children. And one of the things that I've done over the past 3 decades as an environmental advocate is to constantly go around and confront this this argument that an investment in our environment is a diminishment of our nation's wealth. It doesn't diminish our wealth. It's an investment in infrastructure. The same as investing in telecommunications or road construction. It's an investment we have to make if we're going to ensure the economic vitality of our generation and future generations. And one of the things people have said to me, because of sort of where I came from, how I came through the environmental movement, through the through this blue collar and group of small time capitalists, people have asked me I saw the injustice of that and saw that this whole thing was skewed, and what they're and what all these right-wing think tanks that pretend that they're free market think tanks, but if you look at their feet rather than listening to the seductive noise that are coming from their mouths, they hate free market capital. Now, what they want is a very cushy socialism for the rich and a brutal, savage capitalism for the poor. That's what the Koch brothers want when they talk about free markets. They don't really want free markets. People ask me for 30 years, what's the most important thing that we can do for the environment? If you had one law, one advance, and I've always said the same thing. Now I'd say something different. I'd say get rid of the Citizens United case, because we can't do anything without that. And now I'd say, but for 30 years I said the same thing, is the best thing that we could do is have true free market capitalism. And the reason for that is because in a true free market promotes efficiency. And efficiency means the elimination of waste, and pollution is waste. And a true free market would require us to properly value our natural resources, and it's the undervaluation of those resources that causes us to use them wastefully. In a true free market, you can't make yourself rich without making your neighbors rich and without enriching your community. Well, what polluters do is they make themselves rich by making everybody else poor. They raise standards of living for themselves by lowering quality of life for the rest of us. And they do that by escaping the discipline of the free market. You show me a polluter, I'll show you a subsidy. I'll show you a fat cat using political clout to escape the discipline of the free market and force the public to pay his production costs. That's what all pollution is. In a true free market, actors in the marketplace ought to pay the cost, the full cost of bringing their product to market, which includes the cost of cleaning up after yourself, which is a lesson we were all supposed to have learned in kindergarten. Well, what polluters do is they manipulate the political system so that they don't have to obey the rules of the market, and they can pass those costs on to the rest of us through pollution by privatizing the commons. The laws of the state of New York say the people of the state of New York own the Hudson River, and we own all the fish in the river. But we don't own them anymore. The General Electric Company privatized every fish in the Hudson River by putting its pollution in it. The same way that King John privatized the deer and the rabbits and the hare and all the fish in the River Thames. It's the same thing. They got a monopoly on the commons. They stole it. They privatized it. And that signifies a deterioration of democracy. Wherever you see large-scale environmental injury, you will see the subversion of democracy. You'll see the corruption of public officials. You'll see the capture of the agencies that are supposed to be protecting us from pollution. They become sock puppets for the industries they're supposed to regulate. You'll see the erosion of the press, the compromise of the press, the disappearance of local control of zoning laws or planning laws, and these kind of local sovereignty is eliminated. And you'll see the end of transparency. Stuff starts happening because pollution is always illegal, and it violates the rules of democracy. It allows, these powerful entities to steal and capture our public resources. They have to be sneaky when they do it. And they have to corrupt public officials and steal elections and do all this other stuff. And, we have to understand what riverkeepers do, what the waterkeepers do all over the world is, we enforce these laws. We're a law enforcement group. That's the niche that we fill. And we don't even consider ourselves environmentalists anymore. We consider ourselves like free marketeers because we're going out into the marketplace to catch the cheaters, the polluters. And we say to them, we're going to use the law and drag you to court, and we're going to force you to internalize your costs the same way that you internalize your profits. Because as long as somebody is cheating the marketplace, it distorts the whole market. And none of us gets the advantages of the efficiency, the prosperity, and the democracy that free market capitalism otherwise promises our country. And what we have to understand as a nation is there's a huge difference between free market capitalism, which makes a nation more efficient, more prosperous, and more democratic, and the kind of corporate crony capitalism which we have now endorsed on Capitol Hill and the state capitals and elsewhere, which is as antithetical to efficiency, prosperity, and democracy in America as it is, in Nigeria. So, having said that, I'll say this. To me, the most exciting thing that's happening right now are the technology developments in the marketplace that allow us. Martin Luther King said that the tools of activism were agitation, legislation, and litigation. And I've done all those things. But I would say the most revolutionary tool that we have now, and the one that gives me great optimism at a time when there's no reason for anybody to have optimism about the future, is innovation. Because I see, Keith, when he introduced me, said that I'm a partner, and I was a partner in Vantage Point, which is the biggest green tech venture capital firm in the world, and I'm also on the board of dozens of companies that are changing the planet and that have these new technologies. And I see what's happening in the marketplace right now. And the ability of those new technologies to transition us to green energy and to democratize the marketplace. A government like our government, every government tends to reflect the political organization of a country tends to reflect its economic organization. So if the major sectors like energy are owned by a few small companies, large conglomerates of wealth like Exxon or the Koch brothers, the government is also going to look like that. It's going to devolve from a democracy into an oligarchy, or what we have now, which I would call a corporate kleptocracy. And the best way to get that back is to democratize our energy system. And that's what solar does, and that's what wind does. And the potential for those things to function are, the only thing that's preventing them is the control, the inertia, and the control that the carbon incumbents have in the marketplace. And, the free market capitalism is not a god. It's a tool. You use it to build a society that you're proud of. And you change the rules of it, you change the rules that govern the marketplace to make sure that it ends up in the place with a society that you want it to have. So, right now, we have a market, the energy sector is governed by rules that don't do that. They're rules that were written by the incumbents, by oil, coal, gas, and nuke, to favor the dirtiest, filthiest, most poisonous, most destructive, most addictive fuels from hell, rather than the cheap, clean, green, wholesome, safe, and patriotic fuels from heaven. And we need to change the market around so that people can make money by doing good things for society, rather than forcing people to make money by hurting the rest of us. And, we did this in most of the states in this country. The way that utilities make money is by burning as much coal or oil as possible. The more they burn, the more money they make. That's not a rational way. That's not a way to rationalize the marketplace to serve humanity or to serve the globe or to serve our country. In California in 1983, my group, NRDC, rewrote the rules here so that utilities in this state can make money by getting people to do good things. by conserving energy, by switching to green energy, and by efficiency. And as a result of that, Californians today use half the energy that other Americans use on average. And that's a good thing. We ought to be able to do that. I wrote about 2 years ago, I wrote an article for the New York Times with David Crane. We co-authored it. And David Crane at that time was the CEO of the biggest energy generator in this country, NRG. NRG has coal plants, gas plants, oil plants, nuke plants, wind, hydro, and a little bit of solar. He's agnostic at that time. He was agnostic about what kind of energy he used. He had to use the cheapest energy, or build the cheapest energy for his shareholders, for the consumers. So, and what he wrote in that article is that in 26 states at that point, in 26 states, if he had $100 million to spend on a new power plant, he would not build a gas plant. What at that time was a historic low, $2 per 1,000 cubic feet. He would spend it on solar, because solar was now the cheapest form of energy in the marketplace, in any of those, in half the states. Today, virtually all the states, it's the cheapest, because the cost of PVs has gone down 30% since we wrote that article. Two of my companies built the two biggest solar plants in North America, one up in Ontario and the other in the Mojave Desert. So I know what those plants cost. To build a Mojave plant, which is a solar thermal plant, is $3 billion a gigawatt. Today, solar costs, if you do a PV plant, costs $2.4 billion a gigawatt. Okay, so it costs us $3 billion a gigawatt to build that plant. How much does it cost to build a coal plant? $3 billion a gigawatt. How much an oil plant? $3 billion a gigawatt. A gas plant, the same. How much a nuclear power plant? $15 billion a gigawatt. That's the last one built, the one in Norway. $15 billion a gigawatt. We could make energy by burning prime rib if we wanted. Why would we use the most expensive form? And then, and that's the upfront cost. Then you have to store the waste for 30,000 years, which is 5 times the length of recorded human history. And who's going to pay for that? The taxpayers. That's an externalized cost. Once you build our plant, it's free energy forever, because the photons are hitting the earth for free. So all you do is build the capital costs. Well, what happens when you build a coal plant? Now the big costs start, because you got to buy the fuel, which means you got to cut down the Appalachian Mountains, ship them across the country in rail yard, pulverize the roads with 40,000-pound trucks, warp every rail in this country. That's why we can't have high-speed rail, because the coal gondolas have wrecked our rail system. Then you burn the coal and poison every freshwater fish in America with mercury and kill 80,000 people a year with ozone and particulates. How about an oil plant? $3 billion a gigawatt capital cost. Then you have to pay for the fuel. So now we have to go to Saudi Arabia, punch holes in the ground, bring up the oil, refine it expensively, genuflect to the sheiks who despise democracy, are hated by their own people, and won't let women drive an automobile, and get in periodic wars to protect their pipelines. $4.3 trillion the last two cost us. And we ship the oil across the Atlantic in a tanker that is protected by the military. And guess what? Exxon doesn't pay for it, you and I do. And they spill it all over the Gulf and spill it all over Valdez, and then they burn the oil, and acidify our lakes and poison our trees and poison our kids and everything else. So that's the true cost of oil, which they're not paying for, you and I are. But with a wind plant or solar plant, you're now paying $2.4 billion a gigawatt, so the capital costs are less. These companies are dinosaurs who have already gone extinct, but they don't know it. If we competed against them on a flat playing field, they would not last one day in the marketplace. They cannot function in true free market capitalism, particularly if they had to pay their externalities and get rid of their subsidies. So, and that's the kind of world that we need to be looking for. I talked to Amory Lovins about 6 weeks ago, and he showed me these two photographs. And one of the photographs was taken on 48th Street in New York City in 1903, and it's a photograph of, looking up the street uptown, looking up Fifth Avenue, and in that photograph there are hundreds of horse buggies, and there's one automobile. And in 1913, 10 years later, he has another picture from the same vantage point. And in that picture, there's hundreds of automobiles and one buggy. And the buggy drivers never saw it coming. They were completely eliminated in 10 years. The same thing happened with flat screen TV. And 13 years ago, flat screen TV cost $10,000. And they were, a plaything for the 1%. Today, you can go down and buy one for $290 at Target. And the last vacuum tube television set company shut its factory 5 years ago. So in a 7-year period, you had a disruptive technology that completely destroyed a world-dominating business. And Henry Ford, during that 10-year period between 1903 and 1913, when the buggies all went out of business, he dropped the price of Model Ts over that 10-year period 67%. Well, in the last 5 years, the price of photovoltaic cells has dropped 600%. So there is no economic rationale anymore for carbon fuel. It's a crazy way, an insane way for us to be powering our society, of digging up poison rocks and burning them. It's prehistoric. Like I said, the dinosaurs don't know they're dead yet, but they know, they see it coming. And that's why you see this flurry today of pipelines being built here in California and Oakland, of LNG facilities being proposed, and coal terminals and oil terminals, so that they can ship this stuff across the country and send it to poor countries in Asia. This year, in the last 2 years, the 3 biggest coal companies in this company, Arch, Peabody, and Consol, lost 95% of their value. The top 50 coal companies in America are either in bankruptcy or about to go bankrupt. These industries are dying. So what are they trying to do? What is their strategy? Their strategy is to invest, to get all of us to invest in infrastructure. That's why this pipeline, the Dakota Connector, and that's the XL pipeline, and all these other pipelines that I'm suing today, because I know I just have to put them off, because in a little while everybody's going to see the dinosaurs are dead. But they need to put this infrastructure on the ground. They've already got $27 trillion of infrastructure. When they build that pipeline, it's not just the oil company that's paying for it. It's Goldman Sachs and Morgan, and it's the pension funds, the police, the firefighters, the teachers, the municipalities. Everybody's investing in that pipeline, and what do they need? They need oil going through that pipeline for the next 30 years to pay off the debt that they did. So it gets us all invested in that infrastructure, and that's the anchor that they're depending on to keep their industry alive long after the economic rationale for oil, coal, gas, and nuke is gone. They're going to stay alive through inertia, through anchoring themselves with $30 trillion of infrastructure. And that's why they're trying to build all this stuff right now. And that's why we've got to fight so hard to stop them, because if we fight them for 5 years, if we win, those proposals will be laughed out of the legislatures and the today, the markets already know this. Solar City pays 3% less for its money from the banks than any utility in our country. The utilities are paying more because their business model, markets know that their business model sucks, that they're dying. The markets know this. It's just that they're able to control this because they own the infrastructure and they own the politicians, and they've corrupted our democracy. So our job is to fight for all of those things, to fight, number one, for our democracy back, to get rid of the Citizens United case. Without that, nothing happens because the oligarchs own America, as long as they've got that. And then we have to fight them in our communities and on the ground, and we have to make sure to stop them. And we have to restore the things about this nation that we all love, that we're all proud of. The things, the idealism, the enlightenment, the things that this country is supposed to mean to the rest of humankind, and that the oil companies have done so much to take away from us. Anyway, this is the heart. Berkeley is the heart of representative democracy, Berkeley and Boston. And I was here in 1969 and saw it with my own eyes. And my father came here a few weeks before he died and spoke to this place because this is the place where that has, when everybody else has walked away from democracy, Berkeley has kept the fire going. So I'm very happy to be here and very proud to be with all of you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Holly, you can go on the far side. And here we go. Well, I think I just got a lesson in how to teach something I thought I knew how to teach. You lecture on the theory of externalities and the illogic of the Coase theorem far better than I do it. So anyway, yes. So actually, the first question I was given is a very interesting one, especially given the editorial that you put out today. Do dams pollute? If so, what is Riverkeepers doing regarding these polluters?
Well, most dams, again, we now understand our flawed economic model. I wouldn't say I'm always against dams because there's some small headwater dams in places like Chile that probably produce better returns for society than the injury that they cause to society and the ecosystems. But I think most dams don't pass that test. And we fight dams. I mean, it's one of the things I'm not against farming, but I'm against the farming the way most of it's done in this country. I say it about nukes. I'm not against nuclear energy, but I'll be all for it when they can make it economic and when they can make it safe, and they've never been able to do that. And I think that you have to subject dams and every kind of energy to that kind of test. Is it the cheapest form of energy? Is it the most beneficial to society? I just came back a week ago from Peru, where the Peruvian government is proposing to put 22 dams on the Marañón River, which is the biggest headwater to the Amazon, and we have a riverkeeper. We have 3 riverkeepers in Peru, but the riverkeeper there is fighting it. And I went and met with the foreign minister and other members of the government, and when you sit down and start talking about them, you can see that they make no economic sense. They're being driven by the people who own those waterways. And in Latin America, for example, in Chile during the Pinochet regime, all the waterways in Chile were sold to a private utility. And the private utility then, which had been a public utility, and the board of trustees of that, in order to enrich themselves, sold the utility to a Spanish company. So a Spanish company now owns every waterway in Chile. And Jose Ortega, who's one of the great human rights activists in Chile, said to me, when foreign companies own all of your natural resources, that really anything that you call democracy is illusory. It's an illusion. We were supposed to get democracy when Pinochet left, but we don't have it because Pinochet and the Chicago economists who he brought down, Milton Friedman's, gang, what they call the Chicago gang, went down there and sold the roads, the airports, the utilities, the telephone companies, the bridges, and all the forests and all the waterways to private owners. And they're now owned by foreign syndicates. And, Chile's back in a colonial model. It doesn't control the resources of its own land. Peru had the same thing. There's private corporations that are building those dams. The dams make no economic sense. There's much cheaper forms of energy for Peru. But the dam company wants to build the dams for its own reason, not to benefit the Peruvian people, but because its shareholders are going to get rich. And I think we have to subject all projects like that to the same test. Is it beneficial? Does it bring more benefits than cost to the people that it's supposed to benefit?
Holly, I know you know a few things about dams and waterways, so you can use a card or you can follow up on your own.
Well, I'll go to the cards because I think the first two cards that I've been given are asking much the same thing. One says, what are the key, most impactful levers that would move the whole world to commit to a vibrant future environmental destiny within one human generation?
The key
levers.
Okay.
And the other, which I read as asking a very similar question, is how do you inspire an environmental consciousness among people or corporations who do not have one? So in other words, how do we quickly make people care about these things?
Well, the first question is easy. I would say democracy and true free market capitalism, where you eliminate subsidies. The second question, the way that you give people a conscience is that corporations don't have conscience. Corporations aren't allowed to have conscience. Corporations are not allowed to do things that are good for humanity unless they're also good for their shareholders. When you see Walmart bringing bottles of water down to North Carolina for the hurricane victims, they're not doing that to be good people. They're doing it because they believe that act, the specter of that act is somehow going to accrue to greater shareholder value. If they had another reason for doing that, if they were actually just trying to be good people, any one of their shareholders could sue them and they would win the lawsuit for wasting corporate assets. A corporation legally cannot turn itself into a philanthropy. They cannot do good things for the public. It's illegal. And that's the laws that we operate under. Do I think that's bad? No. I think corporations drive the economy. I'm on the board of a lot of corporations, and those corporations are doing good things. You need their mechanisms for a lot that we invented, we perfected in this country, that allow people to accumulate wealth, to assemble wealth, and then to spend it, hopefully for the public benefit. The key is not to try to give corporations a conscience, but rather to force them to act within a legal framework that makes them behave as if they have a conscience. And the law actually has the ability to change morality in a society. The law is a milestone for morality. And that's why I've given that a lot of thought, because we're a law enforcement organization. But I'll give you an example. When I was growing up in New York, where my father was senator, until really, I guess, their mid-'80s, if you went into a diner or a restaurant, lit up a cigarette and blew smoke in the face of the people at the table, nobody would say anything. But then we passed a law saying you can't do that anymore. And now, if you went in and did that, people would regard you as a psychopath or a sociopath, and they wouldn't think that you were just a scofflaw. They'd think that you were genuinely a really bad human being. And the only thing that changed was the law. when I was a kid, there was a law in New York that said curb your dog. So that means that if you were taking your dog for a walk on the street and he needed to poop, you would take him off the curb and make him do it in the road. If at that time I had taken a plastic bag out of my hand and picked up the poop and put it in my pocket and brought it home, people would have thought I was crazy. But today, if you don't do that, you would get lynched by people. And they would, again, think that you're really, really bad. And think about drunk driving, when I was in college, people drove drunk. Let's face it, let's be honest, they did. And if you went to any 7-Eleven store, they sold these I forget what they call them, but they were cup holders that allowed you to hang your beer can from the window of your car so that you could drink and drive at your leisure. They sold those at every 7-Eleven, and people drove like this, and it was okay. So and if the police arrest you, they tell you, usually, if you were white, they would tell you to pull on the side of the road and just sleep it off, right? But then a group called Mothers Against Drunk Drivers popped up and said there's 30,000 people a year being killed by drunk drivers, and we're going to have zero tolerance. So now my kids, who are in college, the other day they were talking about a friend of theirs, and my kids aren't angels, but they were talking about this kid and saying he's a really bad person, he drives drunk. So the morality has changed, and that's how you change corporate morality. You make it so the heads of the corporations are going to be stigmatized if they do something wrong. In Europe, if a corporation pollutes, the guy who runs that corporation is, the politicians don't want to be seen with him, and he's shunned socially because they put people in jail for polluting. Well, we have laws that make it criminal, but nobody ever gets in jail. It's like a joke. And so I think if you want to give corporations a conscience, put a few CEOs in jail, and then, all of them will suddenly get a conscience about that. And that's what happens.
Can I follow up with, if I could just follow up for a moment. Part of what I'm hearing from you is that the morality is already there, that the morality that we need is really about not harming each other, and that most of us would already buy into the idea that we shouldn't harm each other. And that's a lot of what happened with secondhand smoke, is that people came to realize that that was a form of harm, and drunk driving as well, that that was harming others in ways that they hadn't realized before. And I'm wondering if that's enough, or if we need a kind of consciousness about the environment itself. You described watching a peregrine falcon in Washington, D.C. as an important part of your childhood. That seems to me to carry different lessons than just we should not harm each other, or at least to encourage us to see that in a different way. Is it important for people to learn those lessons? And if so, what levers would we pull?
Well, I'm an idealist and an optimist, but I'm also a skeptic and I'm a pragmatist, and I don't believe you can change human nature. I just don't believe you can. I think that society can erect mores, and they do this for all kinds of ridiculous things. You look at, I can think of some of the things that, there was a more, when I was growing up, that being gay was immoral, right? It was wrong. And, I think there was probably a time when, just the idea of homosexuality for me was like confirmation of the existence of Satan. That's the way that our whole society was arranged around here. This week, Great Britain apologized to all the gay people it had put in jail. And it was a crime, and it was regarded as just bad, wrong. And so people erect mores over all kinds of stuff, silly stuff, good stuff, but what it shows is that you can create social mores that change the sense of morality and that do change human behavior. And what we need to do is not have social mores that punish people for loving whoever they want, But to have social mores that punish people who pollute or who steal the fish and the waterways and the air from the rest of us, and that they should be the ones that everybody sees as immoral. And I'll tell you this, I sat on the board with a guy who was the CEO of Procter & Gamble. And it was a green company, and we were all trying to figure out how to change people's behavior to buy green products. And he showed me this very detailed data that Procter & Gamble has assembled over 100 years. It's been looking at buying practices. And what it showed is that people, there are a certain percentage of people, it's between 3% and 5%, and never, ever above 8%, who will pay more for a product because it gives a social benefit. It never gets above 8%, no matter how urgent, no matter what. Even during wartime when people are, trying to help the troops in this, if they don't see a benefit for themselves, they won't do it. Now, if it's a health product that says it's healthy and good for the environment, they'll buy that and they'll pay a lot of premium. But they will not pay a premium on something just to benefit humanity or to benefit the environment. Most people won't. I think Berkeley, it's probably a lot higher, but in the rest of the country, they won't. It just won't. So that's the reality we're dealing with. So how do you, knowing that you can't change human behavior, that the choices are just, that behavior mode is static for a century. You can't change it. But how you can still change behavior. And you can change behavior by making phosphates illegal. By making, other things by making cigarette tobacco illegal, or by raising the price on it. Raising prices on it. We know that change. There's a referendum here in California right now to raise the price on cigarettes. We know for a fact that if you raise the price, no matter what you do with the money, a lot fewer people are going to buy cigarettes. So there's ways to change behavior, but you're not going to change, you need to do that by incentivizing good behavior and punishing bad behavior. And that's what true free market capitalism should do. It should punish bad behavior, which is inefficiency and waste, and reward good behavior, which is efficiency. And you just have to, you have to develop market rules that do that and that allow people to make money, and lots of it, by doing good things and punishing them when they do bad things.
Okay. A question here, and I'll add a small personal add-on to the question. So, interest in how the people in all of these different riverkeeper organizations around the world are actually able to learn from each other and share stories now. What is the link between these people? And, speaking as someone whose brother's a Chesapeake Bay waterman, fierce environmentalist, runs a small diving business, sounded very much like the people you had your early organizational encounters with on the Hudson. Are the people that are engaging in the growth of these riverkeeper organizations, are they the same kind of people you started with on the Hudson? Or is there been a demographic shift?
Interesting, there's a large number, there's 300 of them now. A lot of them were commercial fishermen, particularly on the East Coast. And a lot of them a surprising number of them were also former Marines. I don't know whether it's a coincidence or not, but we have a 27-year Marine Corps veteran named Rick Dove, who organized most of the 14 riverkeepers, very strong programs in North Carolina. They all wear uniforms. They have an Air Force with 22 planes, and they have a whole drone force now that has busted Duke Energy, and almost all of the aerial photographs that you saw of the hurricane damage on CNN and ABC and NBC came from our waterkeepers in North Carolina. So we have and he was a lifelong Republican, and he was a commercial fisherman, and he got radicalized by pollution. We have, on the West Coast, we have a lot of surfers. But all of the people, the thing they have in common is that they're all people who get wet, who are, wearing waders, they're in the mud, they don't look at the environment as something that you look but don't touch. They want to be part of it, and and it's part of their lives and their livelihoods, and they're people who are in the water all the time. So all of them now have boats. To get a license to be a keeper, you have to have a boat. So that's one of the licensing criteria. Your question about how we communicate, that's a big preoccupation of hooking these people. We have a mentoring program. So every keeper, when you get your license, an older keeper mentors you. And then one of the licensing requirements, besides having a boat, is that you have to come to the annual conference. We change the location of the conference every year. But this year we will have 300 keepers who come from all over the world to be at that conference. They spend 5 days with each other, and they share their stories, and they teach each other. And you'll have somebody who sued somebody for atrazine pesticides from India, and another person from California who did the same thing, and those people will talk. So they share strategies, and there's a very strong bond between them. We actually, we pay the keepers to get the logo tattooed on their body. So many of them, we have a tattoo artist come to all the conferences, and any keeper or their staff that wants a tattoo, the tattoo, I would show it to you, but I don't want to show you my tattoo, but it's a sturgeon logo. And when we have the conferences, any member of their staff or any keeper can get that logo tattooed on their body, and it's very funny to see them all walking around with that tattoo. But there's a real brotherhood. Rick Dove, who is the Marine, told me one time, he's the one who made me get the tattoo, because he said to me, I did 3 tours in Vietnam, I was in the Marines for 27 years, and those guys put so much pressure on me to get a tattoo, and I would never get it. And he said, but I feel a greater sense of brotherhood in this organization than I've ever felt anywhere in my life, and I want you to come with me and get a tattoo. And I was like, oh, shit, I can't. I have 7 kids, and I didn't really want to get a tattoo, because then they're all going to think it's okay. And so I got it in some place where they won't see it. I'll tell them.
That's a tough segue. So you probably...
That's one of the funniest grants we've ever had. But we got a grant from somebody who does that. But the funniest grant that we ever got was Bill Murray gave us a grant of $500 a week to buy lottery tickets. I don't know why.
Might work out. So given the timing of this visit, you probably knew that you couldn't avoid the election coming up. So one of our questions is, are you at all optimistic about improved environmental protection in a Clinton administration?
Well, Obama's been, particularly in the last, Obama's had a good environmental record, but compared to other presidents, he's got probably the best environmental record of any president if you look at, particularly the stuff that he did with auto emissions and the stuff that he tried to do in terms of passing the carbon rule, which he did, and they did it by first in the Congress, and they wouldn't do anything he wanted, so he did it by executive order. And that thing is huge. I mean, that is effectively, it will shut down the virtually every coal-burning power plant in our country. But the Supreme, it was challenged by 13 states, and the Supreme Court has, granted it certiorari, so that now we're on delay because it's a 4-4 tie, and they have to wait till Hillary appoints somebody, and then we're going to win that. But he's putting he's doing a wonderful stuff right now with land and national monuments where, we're hoping to see a lot of ocean parks and ocean preservation, ocean monuments in the next couple of months. And, he's had a really good legacy. So is Hillary going to do better than that? I think that just the urgency of the situation is now so grave, that the idea that you can still argue about whether or not global warming, that we're in a crisis now, I think that day is over. There's still people who are going to do it, but they're not going to be taken seriously. I think, the transitioning, we should have transitioned 20 years ago, and we could have saved a lot of things that we're going to lose now, like Miami. But right now, I heard Hillary just talking about it actually this afternoon, where she said, there are dry weather days in Miami when whole streets are underwater now. So, the water supply is gone, the salt water is rising through the sandstone and the limestone, and they're flooding neighborhoods. And the mayor of Miami is a friend of mine, and he just says, we're trying to raise the streets now, but it's a 10-year fix, and after that, it's just gone. So I think their urgency is going to be more and more impressive to people, and we're more likely to get a Congress, I think, that will do something about it. The only way for anybody to do anything is to get rid of Citizens United. This year, the Koch brothers, David and Charles Koch, and, they didn't personally give $1 billion, but they organized 200 friends, and they committed $1 billion. So $1 billion, $990 million was given through these two brothers. So that is as much as the Republican Party put into this race. And as long as you've got, as long as you have that situation where, these oil tycoons can actually outspend a political party, there's no way. And by the way, if you look at the polling data, which I look at a lot, because my family is in politics, and we look at this stuff. And if you look at polling data for the past 15 years, actually back to 1985, the polling data between 85 and 2015, in congressional races, in 90 to 95% of congressional races, the candidate with the most money has won the race. So you can buy the political system in this country, and that's where the Koch brothers are putting their money, into the state legislative races and into the congressional races. They put very little into the presidential race this year. It's very hard to buy a presidential race. So that's the one race that you can't buy, but you can buy Congress. And that's what they've done. So, and as long as they can do that, as long as, we almost lost our democracy once before in our history during the Gilded Age in the 1880s and 1890s. And the corporations were running things. And there was no corporate income tax at that time. They had unlimited wealth. There was overlapping boards of about 20 trusts: the steel trust, the oil trust, the rail trust, the sugar trust. And it was the same people on each one. And at that time, there was no direct election of senators. So the senators were picked by the legislators. And the legislatures were owned and traded like chess pieces. It was said of the Pennsylvania state legislature that John D. Rockefeller had done everything to it except for refine it. And they could just name whoever they wanted to be senators. So they totally controlled the Senate, and this country turned into an oligarchy briefly. And you had this extraordinary coalition of farmers, the populist movement, urban reformers, the progressive movement, Muckraking journalists, we were talking about Upton Sinclair a few minutes ago. Somebody here said that they had gone to a lunch in the Senate cafeteria with Upton Sinclair, who wrote The Jungle about the meat industry, and my uncle Teddy Kennedy. Oh, and Ida Tarbell and all of these muckraking journalists, and then one really powerful dynamic leader, Teddy Roosevelt, who took back democracy. They passed the Sherman Antitrust Act, and they broke up the trust, and they passed minimum wage laws, and they passed the 40-hour work week, and they gave women the vote, and they passed the graduated income tax for corporations. So corporations, for the first time, and wealthy people had to pay at least some small share of their part of running our democracy. But the most important law they passed was a 1907 law that said that corporations cannot give money to a federal election. And exactly a century later, Scalia and Alito and Judge Thomas and passed Citizens United and said, and took away all of the boundaries for corporate contributions to the American political process. And in 2012, there was $1.8 billion spent in total during the presidential and congressional election year. This year, $10 billion. So, and that money, almost all of it is dark money. Nobody knows where it's coming from or who's giving it, except the guys who are running and getting that money from them. And they know who they've tabulated who they owe the favors to. And there's study after study after study that shows that if you don't have huge amounts of money, nobody will listen to you on Capitol Hill. So that's not democracy. And the environment is the first thing sacrificed, because the Koch brothers are not giving $1 billion to our political system because of an impulse for patriotism. They're giving that money because they want a return on investment, and they're getting a huge return on investment because they're liquidating our water, our air, our soils, and our children's health, and making hundreds of billions. The Koch brothers owned $67 billion worth of tar sands. So, and you wonder, why was it that the first thing that the United States Congress, the Republican-controlled Congress, said was their #1 priority? Do you remember what it was? Building the XL pipeline. And that's the first thing that they did when they came into office. A project that its own promoters acknowledged would create a grand total of 35 jobs in this country. And that was their #1 priority. Why? Because they were bought and paid for by the Koch brothers, and the Koch brothers want that Alberta tar sands to flow through that pipe. Oh, it's not, if you own, $30, $40, $50 billion with tar sands, $1 billion investment to make sure that you get it here, that you can buy Congress, is nothing. And that's what's happening, on a macro and micro level with every decision in Congress. The only things that get passed are things where somebody has paid for it. And, we're going to end up paying for all of that stuff. We got to get rid of it.
So I think this is a great follow-on question, in the sense that one of our guests tonight pointed out there are environmental costs associated with green energy, that you've got in California issues with desert tortoise. If you're doing photovoltaics, you've got issues with wind power, with bats in particular, but migratory birds as well, that there are some potential environmental consequences in the agricultural sector from either promoting liquid transportation fuels or subsidizing their production. And so they said, would you comment on those costs and how they should be addressed, and put that in the framework of the full cost environmental accounting that you've been speaking about?
Yeah, I think absolutely then those externalities ought to be accounted for, and they ought to be paid for. but they're they're minuscule compared to the externalities from the incumbents.
I think we've been through all of my questions.
Oh, okay.
And so
I have lots of good ones still here. So
You didn't hand me a big enough
I'm not
stack.
sure whether this is investment advice, given that they understand you have some insight into the market, or if it's a public policy question, but it works both ways. Should our next investment dollar go to batteries for electric vehicles or to mass transit?
Are you asking personal investment advice from me? Or are you saying you should...
Well, I'm an economist, and one of the things I tell people about being trained as an economist is that it trained me absolutely nothing about making investments on Wall Street.
Yeah. So I think, it's really, well, as a nation, we ought to be investing in public transportation, and we ought to be making it easy for people to, we ought to be incentivizing the investment community to invest in batteries by forcing the oil companies to pay the true price of their product. If you did that, you don't need subsidies or support. Amory Lovins has estimated, and he's done a calculation, and Terry Tamminen, who used to run EPA in California, who did this wonderful book called Lives Per Gallon, where he meticulously and scrupulously inventories all of the subsidies that are given to the oil industry. And what he says, it's about $1.2 trillion annually that they get in subsidies. And he was not including the cost of the war. He was just the direct payment, the direct federal subsidies, but also the other externalities of oil, but not the war, not the military ones. Amory Lovins calculated that the true price of a gallon of gasoline, if the oil companies had to pay the true price, would be about $12 a gallon. So that's what we're paying for oil, but they don't pay it. You and I do. And if they actually were forced to internalize those costs, to pay all the healthcare costs and the crop damage and the acid rain damage and all that other, and the pollution costs, and that was reflected in the price of oil, then we'd be paying $12 at the pump, and we'd be sending the correct signals to the marketplace. And the market would be saying, we need an alternative to a gasoline car, because every American would say, well, it costs about 0.3 cents a mile to drive an electric car, and it costs about $4 a mile once you get, to buy a gasoline car, and we'd very quickly transition, and you would incentivize all these people out there who are adding efficiencies to lithium-ion batteries and looking at different battery systems. So because I'm in this business, I see lots and lots of these technologies and lots of these companies, and the really good people are the people who know how to pick them, and it's not because it's a good technology. It's the team, it's the capitalization, and it's a lot of other factors, the capacity to get it into the marketplace. The best technology does not always win in the market. There's market failures. So but there are hundreds of those technologies out there right now, and what we need to do is to create an ecosystem where the most efficient ones are going to make it quickly into the marketplace. And that's all, I would say. I would not say that the federal government should be betting on a certain technology. They should be creating an ecosystem that incentivizes those kind of efficiencies and punishes the inefficiencies of oil and coal.
If you have a question, you can ask it. Otherwise, I'll go out on thin ice and ask a legal question.
Well, I was going to ask a law question, actually, so I will ask this. So you mentioned the rediscovery of the Rivers and Harbors Act by the folks in Crotonville, which turned out to be a very good lever for them to be able to pull. given that we've been talking about the dysfunction in the political system, and I think no one is terribly optimistic that we'll get a bunch of new environmental legislation anytime soon. Are there levers that are out there in existing legislation that we haven't yet been pulling that we could rediscover? I mean, you also mentioned the Clean Power Plan, right? So the Obama administration's been trying hard to pull the Clean Air Act lever. That's run into various difficulties with the courts, which may be resolved in other ways. But are there other levers we aren't thinking of yet that are already out there?
Well, as you know, I mean, you can still use the Rivers and Harbors Act, but you need a friendly U.S. attorney, and you need to find a discharge of a pollutant that doesn't have a permit, a Clean Water Act permit. The Clean Water Act kind of preempted the Rivers and Harbors Act, but not altogether. The Rivers and Harbors Act is still on the books, and we, in fact, continue to use it. We find unpermitted polluters all the time. And occasionally we have a good U.S. attorney in the Southern District in New York who will say, yeah, bring me cases and I'll sue them. I'll prosecute them. When we wrote the federal statutes, like the Clean Air Act, as you know, Holly, we knew by that time that the government agencies were going to be captured by the industries that they regulate. It's called industry capture or agency capture phenomena. So the agencies, through a series of mechanisms, end up getting captured. And they end up becoming like sock puppets for the industry they're supposed to regulate. And they stop enforcing the law. So we knew that was going to happen. So in many of those 28 federal statutes, we included a provision called the citizen suit provision that says when government fails to enforce, that any citizen can step into the shoes of the United States attorney and prosecute that polluter for penalties that are now usually around $30,000 a day and for injunctive relief. And you get your attorney's fees at the end. And the clinic that I run at Pace Law School is largely self-supporting. That's why we can have 3 professors for 10 students, because the professors, we bill the time that we spend on these cases, and we bill at New York rates, which are $900, $1,000 an hour. The students bill at about $100 an hour. And when we win the cases, we collect the money, the school gets to keep it, and that's how they pay 3 professors, at that ratio, which it's a luxury ratio now to have, 1 professor for every 3 students at a law school. But the way we do that is because we have this, we are able to use that law to continue to fund what we do. So it's a very, very powerful law. What we end up doing now, a lot of our cases are lawsuits against the agencies who are trying to cripple our ability to enforce the law against polluters. As you know, probably not as bad in California, but in the other states, they use all kinds of tricks to make sure that we cannot get into court against these polluters. And so we end up suing the agency.
Well, I think we've got our last question here. And I like this one because the motto for College of Natural Resources is see the bigger picture, make a better world. Although I think we really stole Berkeley's ethos when we tried to get that. That's why Berkeley's put more people in the Peace Corps than any other institution in the country. But they're asking, what advice do you have for me as someone that's just starting out in a life in the environmental movement? And I think there's probably dozens of people here that would, from your career, they're starting theirs in the audience. What would you say to them?
Well, it depends. I mean, I feel so lucky to be able to do the kind of advocacy. I feel like it's a gift, that my life has been magical because I love what I do, and I really like being a lawyer because I originally wanted to be a scientist or a veterinarian or something. I knew I was going to do the environmental work. And we need really good scientists out there. But I think being an attorney has given me a versatility that where I've continued to be, to love what I do. And I like being in fistfights with the bad guys all the time. But it's given me the ability also to go and do technology and to be valuable for the companies that, that I'm working with in those arenas. And so I get to do a lot of different stuff, and at the same time, I'm doing the central core thing, which I love, which is protecting the environment. So I would say if you're a really good scientist and you're really, that is going to hold your interest for 40 or 50 years of work life, you should do that, because we need people who are going to do that. But I'd say if you want to be an advocate and you don't really know, you know that you want to do this, you know that you want to spend your life protecting the environment and protecting the communities that rely on it and making sure that we create communities for our children that provide them with the same, and this is one of the, maybe I'll go there. This is one of the things that I learned from the fishermen, is that we're not protecting the environment so much for the sake of the fishes and the birds, that we're protecting it for our own sake, because we recognize that nature is the infrastructure of our communities, and that if we want to meet our obligation as a generation, as a civilization, as a nation, which is to create communities for our children that provide them with the same opportunities for dignity and enrichment and prosperity and good health as the communities that our parents gave us. We've got to start by protecting our environmental infrastructure, the air we breathe, the water we drink, the wildlife, the fisheries, the public lands, those things that, as I said, can't be reduced to private property ownership, but by their nature are the assets of the community, the commons, the commonwealth. And for me, the law has given me a versatility in being able to address a range of problems. So I'm not confined to forestry or water or energy or toxics. I'm able to go from one to the other. And I'm really happy that I chose that path. And I really love, I think right now, after 30 years of being in fistfights literally every day of my life, it's really fun for me to do this technology, and to know that. And I suppose if I was young today and going to school, and I have kids who are in school and want to do this kind of thing, and I've said, the two things I said to my sons, and their two sons are different. One of them I said, become a class action lawyer, because I think that is, if you really want to punish the polluters, that's the best way to do it. And we have some great class action lawyers in this audience tonight. And the other thing is to learn how the electric system works, and learn how the grid works, and try to understand energy, because there's so many opportunities now to really change the world through technology, and changing our energy system is really the spear tip of that. And that if you understand that system enough so that you become valuable to people, that's a wonderful way to spend your life. So,
great advice. Thank you very much.